Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unexpected encounter. At 35, Emily Hargrave took great pride in her career as a first-class flight attendant for Skylux Airways, a company known for its prestigious reputation and high standards. She had worked her way up from economy class, polishing her skills and learning the intricacies of serving elite passengers. Emily often said her job wasn't just about serving drinks or meals, it was about creating an atmosphere of luxury, ensuring that every passenger felt they belonged among the stars. On this particular day, Flight 742 from Los Angeles to Tokyo promised to be a routine journey. The first-class cabin was filled with its usual assortment of high-profile passengers, celebrities, CEOs, and other affluent individuals. Emily had reviewed the passenger manifest thoroughly before the flight, recognizing a few notable names, including a renowned tech mogul and a celebrated fashion designer. However, one name caught her off guard: the Anderson family. She had never heard of them before, and their simple-sounding name didn't align with the usual first-class clientele. As passengers began boarding, Emily stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, her signature smile in place. Her uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair tied back in a neat bun, and her posture exuded professionalism. She greeted each passenger with a warm, practiced welcome, ensuring every detail was perfect. Then came the Anderson family. A tall, confident man in his early 40s led the group. He wore a tailored navy suit that, while understated, fit him like it had been crafted by a master tailor. Beside him was a woman of similar age, dressed elegantly in a light gray ensemble that exuded quiet sophistication. Two children followed closely, a boy, around 10, holding a book, and a younger girl, clutching a plush toy. Their demeanor was calm, and they moved with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for newcomers to such a luxurious space. Emily's practiced smile faltered for a split second as she sized them up. They didn't fit the mold of the usual first-class passengers. Where were the ostentatious designer accessories? The flashy watches? The loud proclamations of wealth? They seemed too modest. "Welcome aboard," Emily said, her tone polite but slightly detached. She glanced down at their tickets. Seats 2A and 2B for the adults, 2C and 2D for the children. The prime seats in the cabin, with extra legroom and panoramic views from the windows. "Thank you," the man replied, his deep voice carrying a polite yet assertive tone. He handed over their tickets with a calm demeanor. Emily hesitated. "I'll just need to verify these," she said, stepping aside to consult her tablet. There was nothing wrong with the tickets, they were valid, purchased months in advance, and paid in full. Yet, a nagging thought persisted in her mind: how did they end? Up here? She glanced up, catching the woman's gaze. There was a warmth in her eyes, but also a glint of understanding, as if she knew exactly what Emily was thinking. Emily quickly looked away, feeling a twinge of discomfort. After a moment, she returned, her smile firmly in place. "Right this way," she said, leading them down the aisle. But instead of guiding them to their assigned seats, she directed them to the last row of the first-class cabin, near the dividing curtain to economy. These seats, while still luxurious, lacked the exclusivity of the prime rows. "Here you go," Emily said, gesturing to the seats. The man paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "I believe our seats are in row 2, he said, his tone calm but firm. "There's been a slight adjustment," Emily replied smoothly. "These seats are just as comfortable, and we hope you'll enjoy your flight." For a moment, there was silence. The woman placed a hand on her husband's arm, a silent gesture of restraint. Without another word, they took their seats, helping their children settle in. The man stowed their luggage in the overhead compartment with an air of quiet dignity, his expression unreadable. Emily returned to the front of the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and unease. She told herself she had made the right decision. After all, first class is about maintaining a certain image, she thought. They just didn't fit. The quiet observers. As the plane took off, Emily busied herself attending to the other passengers. She poured champagne for a Hollywood actor and adjusted the reclining seat for a business magnate. But every so often, her eyes drifted to the Anderson family. The father was reading a book, the mother was helping her daughter color, and the son was quietly sketching in a notebook. They weren't doing anything out of the ordinary, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were out of place. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Mr. Theodore Hawthorne, a distinguished older gentleman sitting in the prime seats, had been observing the interaction since the Andersons boarded. A retired lawyer and frequent flyer, Hawthorne had a keen eye for injustice, and something about Emily's treatment of the family didn't sit right with him. When Emily passed by, he leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "That family, why were they moved to the back?" Emily hesitated, caught off guard. "There was a slight mix-up with the seating arrangements," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. Interesting," he said, leaning back in his seat. His tone was calm, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't believe her. A shocking revelation. As the flight progressed, Emily began to notice subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The Anderson family remained composed, but their quiet dignity only made her feel more unsettled. Other passengers seemed to pick up on the tension, casting occasional glances toward the back row. Halfway through the flight, Emily noticed the man take out a sleek laptop, its screen glowing with spreadsheets and complex charts. He worked with an air of focused precision, occasionally discussing details with his wife in hushed tones. It was clear they were used to making important decisions, their calm confidence a stark contrast to Emily's earlier assumptions. As the plane neared its destination, Emily prepared for the landing procedures, still oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. But when the plane touched down and the passengers began disembarking, she was called to the cockpit. The captain, a seasoned professional with decades of experience, handed her a note. "This is for you," he said, his expression unreadable. Emily unfolded the paper, her heart sinking as she read the words, "Please meet us in the VIP lounge after the passengers disembark." The Andersons. Her mind raced. Why would they want to see me? She glanced out the window, noticing a line of luxury vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Something about the scene made her stomach churn. The truth unfolds. The atmosphere in the cabin buzzed with the quiet rustle of passengers gathering their belongings. Emily's heart pounded as she clutched the note from the Andersons. The VIP lounge? It wasn't a typical request from passengers. Normally, such meetings were reserved for high-profile guests to extend gratitude or lodge complaints directly to senior staff. Her mind churned with nervous possibilities. Had she made a grave mistake? She thought back to the Anderson family's silent compliance when she had relocated them. That calm, unshaken demeanor now felt more unsettling than reassuring. As Emily finished coordinating the disembarkation, her colleague Megan approached. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Megan said, her brows furrowing with concern. Emily hesitated. "It's nothing," she replied curtly, unwilling to admit her unease. "Just a minor passenger issue." Megan shrugged and walked off, but Emily could feel her coworker's lingering curiosity. She steeled herself, straightened her uniform, and disembarked the plane. On the tarmac, the luxury vehicles lined up gleamed under the midday sun. One stood out, a sleek, jet-black limousine, its windows tinted to perfection. A member of the ground staff guided her toward the private terminal where VIP lounges catered to the airline's wealthiest clients. Her palms grew clammy as she approached a polished glass door that reflected her own anxious expression. She forced a confident demeanor and entered the lounge. The space exuded luxury. Plush leather seating, gold-accented fixtures, and a panoramic view of the runway gave the room an air of exclusivity. Emily spotted the Anderson family seated at a large table near the window. Michael sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting on his knee, while Vanessa gently sipped tea from a porcelain cup. Their 2 children played quietly nearby. Everything about them screamed control, elegance, and poise. Emily took a deep breath and approached. "Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Anderson." You requested to see me, she said, her voice formal, but the edge of nervousness betrayed her. Michael turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. Please, have a seat, Miss Hargrave, he said, his deep voice resonating with calm authority. Emily hesitated but obeyed. She sank into the plush chair across from them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Silence stretched for a few agonizing moments before Michael spoke again. Do you know who we are, Miss Hargrave? He asked, his eyes locking onto hers. The question caught her off guard. I'm afraid I don't, sir, Emily replied, her voice faltering slightly. Vanessa set her teacup down gently, her movements graceful. We own Skylux Airways, she said softly, her tone calm but firm. Emily's mind went blank. For a split second, she was certain she had misheard. They own the airline? Her throat went dry, and she stared at them, unable to process the words. Michael continued, his voice measured. I founded Skylux Airways 12 years ago, and my wife has been instrumental in growing it into one of the most successful airlines in the world. We built this company from the ground up. Emily's chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. The family she had dismissed, the family she had moved to the back of the cabin, they owned everything. The irony struck her like a slap to the face. She had tried to assert her authority, believing the Andersons didn't fit the first-class profile, only to learn they were the epitome of it. Do you know why we asked to speak with you? Michael continued, his tone never rising, but his words carrying an undeniable gravity. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her usual confidence had evaporated entirely. I'm not sure, she stammered. Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. Your behavior toward my family did not go unnoticed. From the moment we boarded, you judged us. You decided, based on appearances, that we didn't belong in first class. Vanessa chimed in, her voice gentle, but firm. You didn't just relocate us, Miss Hargrave. You demeaned us without a word. You treated us as if we were a problem to be solved, rather than guests who deserved the same respect as everyone else. Emily's face burned with shame. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were trembling in her lap. I didn't mean to offend you, she said weakly. It wasn't my intention. Michael's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. Intentions matter, but so do actions. What you did wasn't just poor judgment, it was a symptom of a larger issue. Assumptions. Bias. Prejudice. The word prejudice cut through Emily like a blade. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew they were right. She had made assumptions. She had judged them unfairly, dismissing them based on appearances alone. I'm deeply sorry, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was unprofessional and wrong. Vanessa's gaze remained steady. We aren't here to humiliate you, Miss Hargrave, she said. But we do want you to learn from this. The way you treated us may seem like a small thing to you, but imagine how many others have experienced the same. Emily swallowed hard, nodding. I understand, she said sincerely. I promise this will never happen again. For the first time since the conversation began, Michael smiled faintly. I hope you mean that. Because change doesn't start with grand gestures, it starts with small moments like this. Recognize your assumptions, challenge them, and treat everyone with the dignity they deserve. Vanessa added, we built this airline not just for the elite, but for everyone who values respect, comfort, and equality. You are a part of that mission, whether you realize it or not. Emily blinked back tears as their words sank in. She had spent years perfecting the art of serving first-class passengers, but somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what it truly meant to treat people with respect. This moment was a reckoning, one she wouldn't forget. After a pause, Michael stood, offering his hand to Emily. We'll leave it at that, he said, his voice kind but firm. Thank you for your time. Emily rose shakily to her feet and shook his hand. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn," she said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. Vanessa gave her a small, understanding nod before turning back to her family. As Emily left the lounge, she felt as though she were carrying the weight of the world. The conversation replayed in her mind over and over again. For the first time in her career, she realized that the role of a flight attendant wasn't just about serving passengers, it was about seeing them, understanding them, and treating each individual with the dignity they deserved. Out on the tarmac, the black limousine pulled away, carrying the Anderson family toward their next destination. Emily stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear, and made herself a silent promise, never again. The ripple effect. Emily stepped out of the VIP lounge, her mind in turmoil. The crisp afternoon air hit her as she walked toward the staff shuttle waiting on the tarmac. Each step felt heavier than the last as the weight of her actions clung to her like an invisible shroud. They own the airline. The thought echoed relentlessly in her mind. She had made the grave mistake of judging Michael and Vanessa Anderson, billionaires, yes, but more importantly, people who had carried themselves with quiet dignity. Their words replayed like a loop: change doesn't start with grand gestures, it starts with moments like this. Her own assumptions had painted her actions, and now, she would have to reckon with the consequences. The staff debrief. Emily's shift wasn't over. As a first-class flight attendant, protocol required her to attend the staff debriefing post-flight. Entering the small staff lounge in the private terminal, Emily was greeted by the hum of low conversation and the familiar clatter of cups being rinsed in the kitchenette. Megan and a few other colleagues sat at the table, reviewing their notes from the flight. Megan looked up as Emily entered. "Hey, how'd it go with that family? They called you into the VIP lounge, right?" Her voice carried a mix of curiosity and concern. Emily hesitated. She could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. "It was fine," she replied quietly, brushing past her coworkers to sit at the far end of the table. Megan exchanged a look with the others, but nobody pressed her further, at least, not yet. The supervisor, Mr. Fletcher, entered moments later. A tall, commanding man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, Fletcher had overseen the airline's crew operations for over 2 decades. Known for his no-nonsense approach, he wasted no time diving into the post-flight analysis. "Overall, Flight 742 went smoothly," Fletcher began, skimming his notes. "But there's one incident I need to address." Emily's stomach dropped. Fletcher cleared his throat and glanced toward her. "Emily, I received a report about seat relocations involving passengers in first class. I understand the Anderson family was reassigned to less favorable seats. Care to explain?" Emily's heart raced, but she forced herself to speak. "Yes, sir. I made a judgment call that, in hindsight, was completely wrong. I didn't have any reason to relocate them. It was my error, and I take full responsibility." The room fell silent. Megan's eyes widened, and another attendant, Jack, a newer hire, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Fletcher studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you realize who the Andersons are?" Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. I know now. They own the airline." Fletcher leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "They've been hands-on owners for years. They value integrity and fairness above everything else. This incident, Emily, puts not only your judgment but the airline's reputation into question." "I understand, sir," she said softly. "I'm deeply sorry." Fletcher paused, his sharp gaze never leaving hers. "Sorry isn't enough. This will be documented in your performance review. Additionally, you'll be reassigned to economy class for the next 3 months." A murmur swept through the room. Reassignment to economy wasn't just a demotion, it was a statement. First-class attendants like Emily had spent years perfecting their craft, rising to the elite level of service required for high-paying passengers. Economy class was demanding, with more passengers, fewer resources, and less time to deliver personalized service. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to argue, but she knew she had no defense. "I understand, sir," she repeated, her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. "Good. Let this serve as a lesson to all of you," Fletcher said, sweeping his gaze across the team. "We don't judge passengers by appearances. Everyone who pays for a ticket deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir," the group echoed. New beginnings in economy. The following week, Emily reported for her first shift in economy class. The contrast was stark. Instead of serving 10 passengers in luxury, she now managed over 60 travelers. The aisles were narrow, the space limited, and passengers often demanded her attention all at once. Her first day was chaotic. She spilled orange juice while maneuvering the beverage cart. A child wailed for most of the flight, and a group of college students complained loudly about delays. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Emily slumped into a seat in the galley during a break. "Rough day?" asked Maria, a seasoned economy attendant who had been with the airline for over 15 years. Emily managed a weak smile. "You could say that." Maria handed her a bottle of water and sat down beside her. "You'll get used to it. Economy isn't glamorous, but you learn a lot here: patience, empathy, how to keep people happy when they're crammed into tight spaces. It's a humbling experience." Emily nodded, Maria's words sinking in. She hadn't thought about it that way. First class had been about polish and perfection, but here, it was about humanity, meeting people where they were, tired travelers just trying to reach their destinations. A lesson in humanity. Days turned into weeks, and Emily began to notice small but significant changes in herself. She learned to listen more. The businesswoman who needed an extra coffee to keep herself awake for a big meeting. The single mother, struggling with 2 young kids and a heavy carry-on. The elderly man who just wanted someone to help him adjust his seatbelt. In economy, every passenger had a story, and Emily began to appreciate the value of connecting with people beyond their appearances. One day, during a particularly turbulent flight, an elderly woman clutched her armrest in fear. Emily knelt beside her, holding her hand. "You're safe," she said softly. "We're going to get through this together." The woman looked at her with tearful eyes and whispered, "Thank you. It means more than you know." Moments like that began to heal something inside Emily. The shame she had carried since her encounter with the Andersons slowly began to shift into growth. She understood now what Michael Anderson had meant: change begins with small moments. A familiar face. 3 months later, Emily was back at the training center for her review. Her time in economy had reshaped her perspective, and she approached the meeting with a new sense of humility. To her surprise, as she entered the conference room, Michael Anderson was there, seated next to Fletcher. "Mr. Anderson," Emily said, her voice catching. She wasn't sure why he was there, but her heart raced all the same. Michael stood and smiled faintly. "Ms. Hargrave," he greeted, extending his hand. Emily shook it, her palm slightly damp. "I've been keeping track of your progress," Michael said. "I hear you've done well these past few months. More importantly, I hear you've shown compassion and growth in economy class." Emily blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. Michael nodded. "I hope you understand now what we meant about seeing people for who they are." "I do," Emily replied sincerely. "I've learned that every passenger has a story, and it's my job to honor that." Michael's faint smile grew. "Good. Because we need more people like you in first class, people who've learned the value of respect." Fletcher chimed in. "Congratulations, Emily. You're reinstated to first class, effective immediately." Tears stung Emily's eyes as relief and gratitude washed over her. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As she left the room, she couldn't help but reflect on her journey. The mistake she had made with the Andersons had nearly derailed her career, but it had also transformed her. She understood now that true professionalism wasn't about status or appearances, it was about kindness, humility, and seeing the humanity in everyone. The test of growth. Emily stepped back into the familiar luxury of the Skylux Airways first-class cabin, her crisp uniform freshly ironed, her posture confident but grounded. The last 3 months in economy class had changed her, humbled her. She had learned to see passengers not as categories or assumptions, but as individuals, each with their own struggles, dreams, and journeys. As she smoothed down the last wrinkle in her blazer, she reminded herself of the promise she had made: never again would she let bias cloud her judgment. The flight was from New York to Dubai, a 14-hour journey catering to some of the most affluent travelers in the world. It was Emily's first day back, and she was determined to prove she deserved her reinstatement. The boarding process. Emily positioned herself near the first-class boarding door, her familiar smile genuine for the first time in a long while. One by one, passengers entered the opulent cabin: Hollywood celebrities, well-known CEOs, and even a Saudi royal whose entourage handled his every request. Everything was going smoothly until the Petersons walked in. The Petersons were a family of 3, a man in his 50s, slightly disheveled with a salt and pepper beard, a younger woman in casual jeans and a leather jacket, and a boy of around 13 with headphones around his neck and an old hoodie. Compared to the sharply dressed, impeccably polished passengers Emily was used to, the Petersons stood out. The woman smiled brightly at Emily as they handed over their tickets, seemingly oblivious to the curious looks from the other passengers. The seats, 1A, 1B, and 1C, were some of the best in the cabin. Emily glanced at the tickets, her stomach tensing. Here it was again, she thought, the old test. She had been here before, the moment where judgment whispered in her ear, "They don't belong." But this time, she caught it immediately. A spark of pride lit inside her as she silenced that voice. She smiled warmly. "Welcome to first class, Mr. Peterson, Ms. Peterson. Please let me know if you need any assistance getting settled." The man looked up, surprised at the genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank you, miss," he said softly, with a humility that Emily found endearing. As she helped them to their seats, Emily noticed several heads turning, passengers eyeing the Petersons with thinly veiled curiosity or disdain. One woman, Mrs. Whitmore, a regular first-class traveler and a sharp-tongued socialite, whispered audibly to her husband, "Well, they must have won the lottery." Emily felt the comment like a pinprick. She turned to Mrs. Whitmore with a smile so flawless it was almost weaponized. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you care for your usual glass of Chardonnay before takeoff?" The older woman blinked, taken aback. "Yes." "Fine," she muttered, clearly surprised at Emily's lack of agreement. Emily returned to the Petersons' row, helping the teenage boy stow his bag. "Let me know if you need help with anything during the flight," she said kindly. The young boy smiled shyly, removing his headphones. "Thanks," he said. "I don't usually fly like this. This is kinda crazy." Emily chuckled softly. "It's just a seat on a plane, right? Enjoy it, you've earned it." The words had come out naturally, and for a moment, Emily realized how far she had come. She wasn't just performing politeness, she believed it. The Petersons belonged here just as much as anyone else. The growing tension. 2 hours into the flight, things took a turn. Mrs. Whitmore, who had clearly indulged in too much Chardonnay, called Emily over with an exaggerated wave. "Miss," she slurred, her voice sharp. "That family up there is being disruptive." Emily turned and saw the Peterson boy quietly playing a game on his tablet, his mother reading a book, and Mr. Peterson dozing in his seat. They were anything but disruptive. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Emily replied calmly, "but they seem to be enjoying the flight just like everyone else." Mrs. Whitmore scoffed, her face tightening. "They don't belong here. It's obvious. I don't know what kind of special deal they wrangled to get into first class, but it's an insult to the rest of us." Emily felt heat rise in her chest, but she controlled her reaction. "I assure you, ma'am, every passenger here is valued equally. Please let me know if you need anything else." Mrs. Whitmore grumbled under her breath as Emily walked away. Emily knew that the older woman wasn't just talking about comfort, this was about status. The Petersons didn't look like they fit, and for some passengers, that alone was enough to trigger resentment. The confrontation. An hour later. Things escalated. Mrs. Whitmore rang her call button again, and this time, her complaints grew louder. "I've flown this airline for 20 years, she said to Emily, her voice sharp enough for others to hear. "And I've never had to share this space with people who clearly don't belong. It's embarrassing." Emily inhaled deeply, her hands clasped behind her back. She knew the other passengers were listening. This was a moment of reckoning. "Mrs. Whitmore," Emily said gently but firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. The Peterson family has as much right to be here as you do." The older woman's eyes widened, her face flushed. "Excuse me?" "You've made your point," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "But all passengers in first class deserve respect, regardless of appearance. If you have any further complaints, I'll be happy to escalate them through the proper channels." The socialite gaped at her, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. Finally, she sank back into her seat, muttering something incoherent. Emily turned and caught Mrs. Peterson's eye. The woman gave her a small, knowing smile, one that said thank you without words. The heart of it. When the flight landed in Dubai, the Peterson family lingered in their seats as others disembarked. Mr. Peterson approached Emily, offering her a firm handshake. "Thank you for everything," he said, his voice sincere. "You're good at what you do. People like you are why airlines like this succeed." Emily smiled warmly. "It was my pleasure, sir." As the family walked toward the jet bridge, the teenage boy turned back and waved. "Bye, Ms. Emily. You're awesome." She laughed softly and waved back, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The final lesson. Back in the crew area, Megan caught up with Emily. "I saw how you handled Mrs. Whitmore," Megan said, grinning. "You were incredible. What happened to the old Emily?" Emily shrugged, a smile tugging at her lips. "The old Emily learned a thing or two." Megan looked at her curiously. "What made you change?" Emily thought back to the Andersons and their words, how kindness, dignity, and respect started with small moments. "I realized that everyone has a story," she said softly. "And it's not my job to judge who belongs here. It's my job to make sure everyone feels like they do." Megan nodded thoughtfully. "I could learn a thing or two from you." Emily smiled. She had come full circle. The lesson she had learned on that life-changing flight months ago was no longer a burden but a gift. Now, she carried it forward with pride, ready to make a difference, one small moment at a time. Full circle. Months had passed since Emily's journey toward growth began, a journey she never could have imagined back on that pivotal flight with the Anderson family. Her experience had reshaped her entire approach to her role as a flight attendant, and as she stood in front of the mirror in the Skylux Airways crew lounge, she couldn't help but marvel at the person staring back. The uniform was the same, the crisp lines, the neatly tied hair, and the polished shoes. But the person wearing it was different. Her transformation had not gone unnoticed. Passengers regularly complimented her calm professionalism, and her colleagues saw a more patient, empathetic leader among them. It had been a long road filled with moments of self-reflection, small victories, and learning to face the discomfort of her own biases. Emily had proven herself, not just to her superiors, but to herself. This was why, on an unusually warm spring afternoon, she found herself summoned to Skylux Airways corporate headquarters for a meeting she hadn't expected. The email was brief: "Ms. Hargrave, report to the executive suite at 2 p.m. Dress in formal uniform. Your presence has been requested by senior leadership." Emily's heart pounded as she made her way through the impressive glass and steel building. The air of importance was palpable. Executives in designer suits strode past, their conversations punctuated by confident tones and sharp nods. She felt like an outsider among them, until she reminded herself of how far she'd come. "I earned my place here." The executive boardroom. Emily's heels clicked against the marble floors as she entered the sprawling boardroom on the top floor. The room was bathed in sunlight pouring through massive windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. At the center of the room sat Michael Anderson and Vanessa Anderson, alongside several Skylux executives. Their presence alone made Emily's breath catch, but this time, it was different. She wasn't trembling with guilt or shame, she stood tall, calm, and ready. "Ms. Hargrave," said Michael Anderson, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming." Emily extended her hand, shaking his firmly. "It's an honor, Mr. Anderson." Vanessa stood beside her husband, smiling warmly. "It's good to see you again, Emily." Emily nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson." "Please, have a seat," Michael gestured. Emily sat down, feeling all eyes on her. The table was surrounded by senior executives who likely made decisions worth millions every day, and yet she sat among them, representing her position as just a flight attendant. Still, there was a quiet strength in the moment, something unspoken, as though she belonged here after all. Michael began to speak, his voice calm and deliberate. "Emily, we brought you here because we want to talk about transformation, not just yours, but the kind we're working to inspire across Skylux Airways." Vanessa chimed in, her tone soft but commanding. "We've been monitoring your performance, especially after what happened months ago. It would have been easy for someone in your position to deny, deflect, or hide. But you didn't. You faced your mistakes, and instead of running from them, you grew." Michael nodded. "Your time in economy class wasn't a punishment, Emily. It was an opportunity to rediscover what it means to serve with empathy and dignity. Not every flight attendant would have come back stronger. You did." Emily's chest tightened with emotion as their words sank in. They weren't reprimanding her, they were honoring her growth. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That experience changed me in ways I can't fully explain." Vanessa smiled warmly. "We noticed. Passengers and colleagues alike have praised your work ethic and your ability to connect with people. You've reminded us all that the heart of this airline isn't luxury seats or fine dining, it's the people who make those moments meaningful." A new opportunity. Michael leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Emily, we'd like to offer you a new role within Skylux Airways, a customer experience ambassador for first-class service." Emily blinked, stunned. "Customer experience ambassador," she repeated, trying to process the words. Vanessa nodded. "This is a leadership position, one where you'll not only serve passengers, but also mentor and train other flight attendants. We want you to bring the lessons you've learned, humility, empathy, and integrity, and use them to elevate our customer experience across the airline." The room was silent as Emily absorbed what she'd just heard. She had been given an opportunity not only to redeem herself, but to shape the future of the airline. Her growth, her struggles, her humbling lessons, none of it had been for nothing. I don't know what to say," Emily said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This means more to me than I can put into words." "Say yes," Michael said with a small smile. "Because you've earned it." Emily's lips curled into a smile as tears threatened to blur her vision. "Yes. I'd be honored." The reunion. Months later, Emily stood in the gleaming first-class cabin of a Skylux Airways flight bound for London. This time, her uniform carried an added insignia, a silver pin that denoted her role as Customer Experience Ambassador. The title didn't change the tasks of her job, greeting passengers, helping them settle in, and ensuring a seamless experience. But there was a newfound purpose in everything she did. She wasn't just serving meals and adjusting seats, she was leading by example. As passengers began to board, a familiar couple entered the cabin. It was Michael and Vanessa Anderson. Emily's heart leaped, but this time, she greeted them with unwavering confidence and warmth. "Welcome back to Skylux Airways, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice steady and sincere. Vanessa smiled. "It's good to see you again, Emily." Michael extended his hand, and Emily shook it firmly. "You look like you found your place," he said with a proud glint in his eyes. I have, Emily replied. Thanks to you. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice low but kind. You did the work, Emily. Never forget that. As they moved to their seats, Emily couldn't stop the smile spreading across her face. For so long, she had believed that status defined worth, that appearances equaled belonging. Now, she knew the truth: respect, kindness, and humility were what mattered most, not just in first class but everywhere in life. The final lesson. Later, as the plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, Emily stood at the front of the cabin, watching her team with pride. She saw herself in the young attendants learning the ropes, but now, she could guide them, help them avoid the mistakes she once made. For the first time, Emily understood what it truly meant to be a leader. It wasn't about authority or perfection. It was about integrity, compassion, and lifting others up. As she looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below, Emily whispered to herself, "This is where I belong." She was no longer just a flight attendant, she was the embodiment of change, proof that mistakes can lead to growth, and that growth can lead to something extraordinary.